Last year, I told my viewers that I needed help for a school project where I was going to conduct a study on Overwatch players to see how they felt about the game's ranking system. When all was said and done, I revealed to them that I'd been a silly little guy and tricked them into participating in a study on the Dunning-Kruger effect instead. I had a great time making that video. It was so much fun to gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss my audience like that, and frankly, I really appreciate that you guys were such good sports about it. None of the respondents on that study were upset or angry, at least not publicly. Everyone was pretty chill and friendly and enjoyed the video, and there were a bunch of comments at the time asking if I planned on doing another one. And I really wanted to, don't get me wrong, but I had just lied to everyone and revealed that I had lied to everyone for a study, so I would need to rebuild trust before attempting another study like that. Otherwise, people might come into the new study thinking, okay, Viv lied to me last time, what if he does it again? And that might influence their responses. So instead, I waited. I spent the year thinking about what kind of study I might run next, how I'd run it, and how to ensure that my audience would trust me enough to respond in good faith the next time. And so, 1 year after the first study, I decided I'd waited long enough. I'd built enough trust, and I'd made my audience feel safe and secure with me. After all, it'd been a whole year. Surely I wouldn't hurt them like that again. And can I say from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys for believing that. It made it really, really fun to lie to you again this time. When people signed up for this study, they were told this form is to collect information about potential respondents for a fun pilot study I will be conducting for a video on my YouTube channel, focusing on how Overwatch players perceive the strength of heroes after the Season 9 changes. Respondents signed up, provided their age range, their gender, their ranks, and their contact info. Starting on March 1st, they began receiving surveys asking them to rank the strength of each and every Overwatch hero and role. The first survey just asked them the question outright, and each of the follow-up surveys provided them with information about how the other respondents felt. There were a total of 7 rounds in the study, and only the respondents who completed all 7 rounds were included in the final respondents in the study. That's 130 respondents in total, completing 7 surveys each of which had 42 questions for a total of 38,220 individual pieces of data. Let me tell you, I wasn't really expecting it to get so out of hand. I ended up spending basically the entire month of March dedicating almost all my time, plus a good amount of my money, to energy drinks just to get this project done, to the point where it was making me physically ill several times. I repeatedly also got locked out of my Google account because Google thinks it's suspicious when you create hundreds of Google Forms and Google Sheets at once and then email a ton of people the same text but with different links like this. And you know what? Maybe that's karma. Maybe the universe was telling me, hey, Viv, lying to hundreds of people at once is wrong. Take a canker sore and a headache and reflect on what you've done today. However, I became a VTuber, so I don't have to look myself in the eye if I don't want to, so I blissfully trucked on with the deception. I continued lying to you guys again and again and again all month long until finally on March 30th the study was completed. But what did you lie about, you might be asking? What was the nature of the deception? Well, for one, you've probably read the title. The study wasn't actually about seeing how people felt about the strength of various Overwatch heroes in Season 9, but was rather about seeing how gullible Overwatch 2 players are. Or, alternatively, depending on what title I've settled on, how good I am at gaslighting my audience. However, this one isn't really like the Dunning-Kruger study. The deception of that one was a lot easier to reveal, like you can do it in a single sentence. This one, well, it's more complicated. There's layers to the lies here, and it's easiest to explain it if I do it while explaining the study itself. So, let's just get right into it. Part 1. How did it work? First, I'm going to tell you what the respondents to the study saw, then I'll explain what was going on behind the scenes. Respondents signed up in the latter half of February and received the first round of surveys on March 1st. This same Google form was sent to everyone, since there wasn't really a need to individualize the data yet. Going forward, each respondent would be given an ID number that would be used for future surveys, so I would create a unique Google form for each subsequent round for each survey for each respondent. Again, we talked about the number of people involved. I hope you know that that was an immense pain in the ass. In the first round, the instructions were as follows. For each survey in this study, you will be asked to rank each Overwatch role and hero on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 representing, quote, I feel this hero/role is very weak, end quote. 10 representing, quote, I feel this hero/role is very strong, end quote. And 5 representing, quote, I feel this hero/role is neither particularly weak nor particularly strong, end quote. Please note that you are only being asked how you personally feel about these heroes and roles. You are not required to justify or explain your position, and you will not be called upon to do so at any point in this study. Please do not discuss your responses with anyone at this time. For this round, you will not be provided with any additional opinions from other respondents or other community members. The first 3 questions were formatted as, how do you currently feel about the damage/tank/support role in Overwatch 2, with the remaining 39 questions being formatted as, how do you currently feel about insert hero name here in Overwatch 2. Heroes were just listed alphabetically and were always listed in the same order for everyone. As the instructions stated, there was no additional information provided in this round. Respondents who submitted it by the end of the weekend were given an ID number and thus were properly part of the study, and received round 2 on either the 4th or 5th. There were some delays because of how long this took. We'll get into that a little bit later. Going forward, the rule was that you needed to complete your survey by the end of the day to receive the next one. If you didn't send it in, you'd get sent a reminder the next day instead. If you ignored 3 reminders for a single survey or 10 reminders across the whole study, you'd get eliminated. I expected a lot more people to get eliminated than actually were, and so ended up having to do a lot more work than anticipated here. Turns out a lot of people really wanted that Ultimate Battle Pass bundle raffle thing, which, side note, I should mention that. I got a couple comments when I was announcing the study, when I mentioned that there was going to be a raffle for this, with people saying, wow, so like Blizzard's sponsoring you for this? Like they're giving you a bundle to give away? Nope. No, I'm paying for that. That's my own money going towards that because I felt like I needed some sort of an incentive, and also I don't think if I asked Blizzard that they would give me one. Anyways, moving on. The round 2 surveys were unique in a couple of ways. For one, they were individualized with the respondent's ID number attached so I could keep track of their responses without needing them to keep using their email addresses or names because people kept on, using different email addresses or changing up their names. They also included a new level to the instructions. As in the previous surveys, you will be answering the same questions as before, but will be provided with an additional piece of information. For this round, you'll be provided with the same information as the previous surveys as well as the average response from players who were ranked bronze or silver in their most recent ranking prior to Season 9. This survey will use the term low-ranked respondents to describe these respondents for simplicity. You are allowed to interpret this data however you see fit. Respondents were being asked the same questions as before in the exact same way, but just now they were being told how the low-ranked respondents had answered it on average. Then they'd send in round 2 and get round 3, which contained another new piece of information. For this round, you will be provided with the same information as the previous surveys as well as the responses I gave to each question. This survey will describe these responses as Vivros' responses for simplicity. You are allowed to interpret this data however you see fit. Again, respondents were given the same questions as before, but now were given 2 pieces of data, mine and the low-ranked player's data. Respondents who completed this round were sent round 4, which once again included a new piece of data. For this round, you will be provided with the same information as the previous surveys as well as the average response from players who were ranked gold or platinum in their most recent ranking prior to Season 9. This survey will use the term mid-ranked respondents to describe these respondents for simplicity. You are allowed to interpret this data however you see fit. Once again, the same questions were asked, but now with 3 points of data: low-ranked players, me, and mid-ranked players. For round 5, they were thrown a bit of a curveball. For this round, you will be provided with the same information as the previous surveys as well as the average response from a handful of larger Overwatch content creators. These creators are Blat, CarQ, Emong, ML7, A10, Fitzy Here, Warn TV, Aspen, Skysty, and Fariha. This survey will use influencers to describe these respondents for simplicity. Given that the influencers had a uniquely divergent range of scores, their range will be the 3 closest whole numbers instead of the 2 that were done for previous groups, i.e. if the average was 6.67, you will be told that their response range was from 6 to 8. You are allowed to interpret this data however you see fit. What a get, right? Crazy that all these people responded to the study. I honestly didn't expect any of them to answer an email, but hey, you never know until you try. Anyways, this meant that round 5's questions came with the data from low-ranked players, me, mid-ranked players, and the influencers. For round 6, you can probably guess what they were told. For this round, you will be provided with the same information as the previous surveys as well as the average response from players who were ranked Diamond, Masters, or Grandmasters in their most recent ranking prior to Season 9. This survey will use the term high-ranked respondents to describe these respondents for simplicity. You are allowed to interpret this data however you see fit. So that's round 6. Low-ranked, me, mid-ranked, influencers, and high-ranked. But I said 7 rounds, right? Who else is left? Well, the respondents themselves. Round 7 was unique. The data they had previously been given was wiped from the survey and instead they were given the following instructions. As in the previous surveys, you will be answering the same questions as before, but you will not be presented with the same information as before. In previous surveys, you were sent information about how other groups of respondents answered these questions. However, this time, you will instead be presented with all your previous responses from each of the previous surveys. You are allowed to interpret this data however you see fit. So, instead of seeing how other people responded, round 7 was a reaction to them reacting to the data they had previously been given. Bit of a sneaky trick, since almost every single respondent had some fairly dramatic variations over the course of the study. Which version of themselves would they agree with? These were all opinions they had previously held, so how would they react? Anyways, that's what the respondents saw. However, I told you I lied. But how? Part 2. The Deception. Behind the scenes, things were significantly more complicated than they initially appeared. For one, I had secretly divided all respondents into 2 groups, trying to generally divide them evenly based on gender, rank, and age. However, since some people were eliminated as the study went on, and I obviously couldn't just move people from one group to the next, they weren't perfectly balanced by the end on these counts. They did have the same number though, weirdly enough. They did both end up at 65 each. Sorry, tangent. Back to the 2 groups. Group 1 was internally labeled the tailored group, while Group 2 was internally labeled the generic group. If you're a respondent and you're wondering where you fell into this, there was a debriefing email that was sent to you. Feel free to go check that out and see which group you were in. Both groups were deceived in unique ways. But before I get into that, I want to acknowledge that some people did get suspicious that there was some deception going on before it was revealed to them. The most prevalent theory that I received was that I had swapped the numbers of low-ranked and high-ranked respondents. Basically, that I had taken the opinions of people generally perceived to have the least authority, ascribed them to the people generally perceived to have the most authority, and then did the same in reverse as well. This wasn't a bad theory, but what I find interesting is that it's based on the assumption that the numbers I included must still be real opinions held by someone, even if I was crediting them to the wrong person. My best guess as to why this happened is that people generally seem to find the low-ranked players to be more correct than they'd expected them to be, and found the high-ranked players to be more incorrect than they'd expected, and came to the conclusion that I'd simply lied about who said what. And again, an interesting theory. It wouldn't have been a bad idea, frankly. Probably also would have been much less work than the actual trick that was going on here. See, what actually happened here is that all of the numbers were fake. I didn't average out the responses of low, mid, and high-ranked Overwatch players to find their averages, I never filled out the survey myself, and I certainly did not get those much bigger YouTubers to fill out the study. Frankly, I'm shocked that nobody really called me on my bullshit for them, especially because their data was uniformly insane in the studies. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The true deception of this study is that none of the numbers were real. They were entirely made up to test two separate hypotheses within the same category. How gullible are Overwatch players? For the generic group, the hypothesis was, is it possible for me to shape a group of people's opinions with fake data in such a way that it would reflect that a group of people will consistently shift their opinions based on the opinions of others? In other words, if I take a diverse group of respondents in terms of age, rank, and gender and tell them all the same lies, can I get them to not only agree about the strength of various roles and heroes more than they previously did, but to specifically agree on something that is different from their starting point and isn't based in anything factual? So here's how I went about telling the lie, and I'm going to be throwing a lot of numbers at you. Don't worry too much about retaining the exact details, since this is more just about showing how I came up with my lies. You don't really need to remember this in detail. The low-ranked response was actually the average response of all respondents. Again, this won't reflect the exact average of all respondents in the end, since some people were eliminated and not all those people were in group 2, but I wanted the one that reflected the average of the audience as much as possible. The averages were always decimals, obviously, so I would just make it a range of the two closest whole numbers. For example, respondents ranked DPS had an average strength of 7.68, so they were told the range for low-ranked respondents was 7 to 8. The Vivaros response would then be the result of randomizing either +2 or -2 from the average response given previously, in the opposite direction of the low-ranked respondents. For DPS, since 7.68 is closer to 8 than to 7, that meant the low-ranked respondents had gone in a negative direction from the starting point. So the Vivaros response was a +2, meaning that my answer was 9.68 or 9 to 10. Mid-ranked players were the average of the low-ranked and Vivaros responses, so for DPS that number was 8.68, meaning the range was 8 to 9. The influencer response took the average initial response, and then it was either randomly +3.5 or -3.5. And again, influencers were unique since I gave them a range of 3 whole numbers instead of 2. For DPS, it was -3.5, so their response ended up being 4.18, or a range of 3 to 5. Finally, high-ranked responses were randomized to either be +5 or -5 from the influencer response. For DPS, it was +1.5, which gave us 5.68, which meant a range of 5 to 6. Thus, the generic group was told the following for DPS. I'm not going to read all this out, that's just not worth it for both of us. Repeat this process for each role and hero, and you get several hundred lies being told to the generic group to see if I could shift them from a starting position into something different and potentially more uniform based on my bullshit. We'll get to whether or not that worked in a minute, because there's also the tailored group. What kind of bullshit do you think I was on for them? Spoiler alert, I was on more bullshit for them than you're possibly even imagining. See, I said there were two separate hypotheses being tested here. For the generic group, I wanted to see if the gaslighting could be collective, if it would be possible to demonstrate some sort of consistent enough shift among respondents to indicate that people generally will respond in a similar way to the same data, and end up agreeing on something different, even if it's based on complete bullshit that they do not actually agree with or believe in. However, the tailored group was, as the name might suggest, tailored. Respondents in the generic group were all given the same numbers as one another, and that was not the case for the tailored group. And if you were wondering why this study took so long, it's because of how the tailored group worked. The hypothesis being tested with this group was, is it possible for me to make people individually reject their own opinions if they are being told that they are uniformly the opinions of low-ranked respondents, particularly when they are given false data that has been tailored to consistently tell them that other more authoritative respondents disagree more and more strongly with them? In other words, if I told respondents that their opinions were all bronze takes and that all the better ranked players and content creators disagreed to varying degrees, would I be able to pull them away from the starting point? If so, how much each time and how much in total? The way this worked is that I made a template for each respondent and plugged in their numbers. Then I added a bunch of stock formulas that would randomly churn out one of two sets of numbers. Then I'd go back in and manually make adjustments for any answers the respondents gave that were either a 7 or higher or a 3 or lower, because otherwise the formula might yield impossible numbers like an 11.5 out of a range that should only go up to 10. For anything where the respondent answered with a 4, 5, or 6, they were random, but they were consistently random, meaning that if two people both rated a tracer as either a 4, 5, or 6, they would both get the same formulas applied. This took, and I cannot stress this enough, multiple full days to do. It was awful, and because of how I was doing the charts, I think it also made me go partially colorblind for a bit. Anyways, as an example, this random respondent initially ranked support as a 5, meaning that was our starting point. Low-ranked responses for this group were always going to be touching the starting point, meaning that one of the whole numbers for the range would always be the respondent's starting point as well. Since the starting point for this was greater than 3 and less than 7, it could have been either a 4 to 5 or a 5 to 6. However, for this one it was 5 to 6. Then the Vivaros response would either be plus 2.5 or minus 2.5 from the starting position in the opposite direction from the low-ranked players. Since the low-ranked respondents went positive here, Vivaros went negative and the answer was 2 to 3. Then mid-ranked respondents would be the average of the low-ranked response and the Vivaros response, tilted in the direction of the starting number. In this case, the average would be 4, and since the starting position was 5, the mid-ranked respondent range was 4 to 5. The influencer responses would be either plus 4 or minus 4 from the starting position in the same direction as the low-ranked players. Since the low-ranked response had gone positive, this is plus 4, which was 9. And since the influencers were given a range of 3 whole numbers, their range was 8 to 10. Lastly, high-ranked players would take the influencer response in either plus 1.5 or minus 1.5 in the direction of the starting position. In our example, the influencer response was 9, so we'd subtract 1.5 and get 7.5, which gives us a range of 7 to 8 for our high-ranked players. As a result, these are the numbers that this respondent received for the support role across this survey. Again, just repeat this process for every role and hero, adjust where necessary to add unique formulas to make higher and lower numbers work, and you get several hundred lies about how people feel about Overwatch. The reason I did this is that the generic group could tell me how a collective would react, but it couldn't really tell me how individuals would react. After all, the generic group's numbers were based on the average of all respondents, and that means there are plenty of people who would appear to agree or disagree with certain sets of fake numbers purely because those were opinions they'd already held that just didn't reflect the average response. Simultaneously, the tailored group can tell me how an individual might react to this sort of data, but given how everyone was given completely different bullshit numbers, it can only really demonstrate how far individuals can be pushed, not whether this reflects a group's opinions on hero strength and stuff like that. If I was only examining group 1, I'd risk missing the forest for the trees, and if I was only examining group 2, I'd risk missing the trees for the forest. So I did both. Ultimately, the goal with the generic group is to see if I can get them to harmonize around an opinion none of them really believed, while the goal with the tailored group is just to see if I can cause discord by giving them a stack of bullshit data that was tailor-made to be contrarian to them. Why? We'll get into that later. For now, I think there's a much more important question to answer. Part 3. Did it work? Now, the fun thing about running a study like this with 2 hypotheses at once is that I have to try and answer 2 different sets of questions about 2 different sets of data that were gathered and expressed in an identical way. Everyone had to be asked the exact same questions in the exact same order in the exact same format in order to ensure that the only variable changing between each round for each respondent was that they were being given new data. However, this means that evaluating our responses to both hypotheses will require us to interpret the data differently. So we're going to do a section 3.1 for the generic group and 3.2 for the tailored group. I know the tailored group is group 1 and generic is group 2. I kind of split them up before I really realized that I'd rather have them the other way around. You know, it doesn't matter. For each subsection, I'm going to explain what the criteria is for evaluating the hypothesis against the data and show the steps taken to reach it. So let's just get right into it. Part 3.1, the generic group. So, just as a reminder, our hypothesis for this group was, is it possible for me to shape a group of people's opinions with fake data in such a way that it would reflect that a group of people will consistently shift their opinions based on the opinions of others? As a result, we're not looking as much at how much the individual shifted their responses in terms of scale, but rather how the group's average responses changed throughout the study in response to new data in terms of direction. Trying to evaluate each individual wouldn't be super useful since the fake data they were provided with wasn't tailored to them. So some of them would be further away than others from the fake data, and it might change their willingness to shift towards or away from it. Again, we already went over this. Now, we're going to end up with a pretty chaotic looking bar chart. There's 42 questions plus 7 sets of data plus all the fake data being highlighted on top of it, so it might be hard to read, and I will show the full graphs where possible on screen, and then also link to a Google Drive in the description that has all of them available to view if you'd like to pause and look at them. I'll also label each one of them on screen with the file name used in the Google Drive just to make it as easy as possible if you want to follow along. The main thing we're going to be looking for here is if there is a consistent shift in the responses, to see if there's a correlation between certain pieces of data being given to our respondents and a particular type of response. Now, some degree of variation on each individual question is inevitable. If I ask you to answer this study a dozen times back-to-back in a single day, there's a good chance you'd change some answers from a 6 to a 7 or a 5 to a 4 just because these aren't precise measurements. It's kind of vibes-based, and you might feel like Genji is like a 6.5, so you answer 6 one time and 7 another time, and you're not lying either time, you're just going with what you feel. However, if 65 people all decide to change their answer on Genji from an average of 7 to an average of 6 after being told the bronze take is that Genji is a 7 to an 8, that might indicate that there's a negative response to the low-ranked opinion. However, just doing that once might not mean much. If they shifted away from the low-ranked opinion on every single hero and role, that would indicate that there definitely is a negative reaction to the low-ranked opinion. If the reverse was true for the high-ranked opinions and the average shifted towards the ranges provided by those responses, we could then say the opposite. Now we'll get into some of the caveats of this after we get into the data, because there are a couple things that we will still need to cover. However, there is a lot of data to get through, so let's just get into it. The blue lines on this chart represent the starting positions gathered in round 1, the averages from across the people who completed all 7 rounds. This data doesn't really mean a ton by itself, so let's add in our round 2 data. Again, blue bars represent round 1, red bars represent round 2, and the yellow highlights represent the range that respondents were told low-ranked respondents had given me. Now, right out of the gate, 4 heroes are in an interesting position. Genji's, Illari's, Mei's, and Reinhardt's starting positions are all outside of the initial low-ranked range. These are, again, just a consequence of having to take averages from all respondents rather than just the members of Group 2 who made it to the end, so their averages were just a little off. Group 2's final respondent group were a little more optimistic about Genji and Illari than the average, and a little more pessimistic about Mei and Reinhardt. However, the main thing we're looking for here is the direction of change, and I think the most notable thing is that, in the majority of instances, respondents generally shifted away from the average low-ranked response, even if it was only by a little bit. For example, they were told that low-ranked players rated the tank role as a 4 to a 5, and they shifted from being almost dead center in the middle of that to being very close to a 5. Or DPS, Tank, Ana, Ashe, Baptiste, Bastion, Brigitte, Cassidy, Diva, Doomfist, Echo, Genji, Junker Queen, Junkrat, Lifeweaver, Moira, Orisa, Ramatra, Reinhardt, Sigma, Soldier 76, Symmetra, Torbjorn, Zarya, and Zenyatta, respondents seem negatively polarized by the low-ranked respondent knowledge. The exceptions are also kind of interesting. Support, Hanzo, Illari, Kiriko, Lucio, Mauga, Mei, Mercy, Pharah, Reaper, Roadhog, Sojourn, Tracer, Widowmaker, Winston, and Wrecking Ball all were positively polarized towards the average low-ranked respondents' responses, and Sombra was somehow actually an exact tie from round 1 to 2. So, what inferences can we draw from this data? Well, the first one is that in a majority of instances, 25 out of 42, being told that something is a low-ranked take seems to negatively polarize the respondents. The only new data provided to the group at large between these 2 surveys was the data in those little yellow boxes, and yet we can see that it seemingly had an effect on the group. In a minority of instances, 16 out of 42, we saw a positively polarized response, and then there was one outlier in Sombra where it was an exact tie between the rounds. Now, to be clear, this isn't like 100%. We can't say that this is like definitively, objectively happening in this way, and I've got a few theories about what happened. The first is that respondents were more likely to care about what low-ranked players said when it came to heroes that people would assume are being played at that level. Widowmaker and Tracer, for example, are heroes that most people would agree aren't really going to be played to their fullest potential at the lowest ranks, and I'm betting that a lot of respondents simply internally thought, like, the bronze take on heroes with high skill floors and or high skill ceilings simply does not matter as much to me, and generally disregarded it. To be clear, this also applies to some of the heroes with negative connotations as well. After all, even though Cassidy and Hanzo had negative correlations, I think they also generally fall into that camp of being heroes where people don't really care that much what a low-ranked player is going to say. The 2 heroes that saw the biggest shifts were Junker Queen and Moira, both of which jumped nearly a full point higher. I think that this round indicates that you definitely can shift people's opinions with outside data, and that people will tend to change their response away from what they've been told a low-skill respondent says. However, we're still not done yet. It's time to move on to round 3. So, now we've got these pink highlights representing the Viveros responses and the yellow bars representing round 3. While the low-ranked responses almost always overlapped with the starting responses, none of the responses hit the Viveros responses. But that doesn't mean it doesn't tell us something. In every single instance, in fact, the respondents shifted their answer towards the Viveros response compared to their responses to low-ranked respondents, and in nearly half of all instances, namely Support, Ana, Bastion, Brigitte, Doomfist, Genji, Junker Queen, Mercy, Orisa, Pharah, Ramatra, Reaper, Roadhog, Sojourn, Soldier 76, Symmetra, Torbjorn, Tracer, and Zarya, or 19 out of 42 questions, they actually reversed their momentum from the previous round. Remember, respondents could still see the low-ranked responses in this round, meaning they didn't forget that data existed, but this seemed to be a more consistently influential factor in how respondents felt. If I can offer my theory behind this, is that respondents not only had a negative variable to go off of now, but also generally a positive one. I mean, if you were filling out this study, you were probably a follower of mine, like you've watched some videos, and if you follow me, you probably are there because you think I generally know what I'm talking about to some extent. If I say I think Ana's an 8 to a 9, the people filling out this survey are more likely to think, he might be onto something, and shift in favor of me. In contrast, when they were told that it was a bronze take to believe that Ana's a 6 to a 7, they seemed to shift away from it to rate her lower, and then rated her higher again when they saw how highly I had rated her. It's also important to acknowledge that these shifts are ultimately pretty small. There's a jump of about a full point upward on both Lucio and Moira, and a drop of about a point for Iliari, but most variations are around half a point or less from round 1 to round 3. Again, this is part of why we're evaluating the generic group as a group rather than individually. We want to see if the average of the group as a whole will show trends to reflect which data indicators are more or less influential. And given that this had a positive trend towards the Vivaros responses across literally every single one of the 42 questions, I think we can safely say that this data point did have an influence. Even though, once again, the data that was supposedly from me was completely pulled out of my ass and based on absolutely nothing. Now, for round 4, we have blue highlights representing the mid-ranked players' responses and green bars representing the round 4 responses. Again, if this becomes hard to read but you want to follow along, there's a link in the description to a Google Drive with all of these that you can pull up if you want to zoom in. The mid-ranked responses were, if you remember from earlier, the average of the low-ranked responses and the Vivaros responses, so they're always in the middle of the pink and the blue. Once again, we see something interesting here, namely that this round had a much less pronounced effect on average than either of the previous 2 rounds. Whether the trend was positive or negative in terms of the mid-ranked responses, there was almost always a small variation from the round 3 results. And this kind of makes sense. After all, the previous data was still available, so respondents weren't just responding to the mid-ranked players in isolation. They were responding to that alongside the 2 datasets they'd been provided so far. On top of that, I think it's likely that most people don't really feel all that strongly one way or another about being told how average players feel about these heroes. After all, they're basically the neutral influence here. You'd expect low-ranked players to have a negative polarizing effect on respondents because who wants to feel like they have a bronze take? And you'd expect high-ranked players to have a positive polarizing effect because people want to feel like they're on the same page as the GMs, but people aren't really going to be polarized that much by the average player, right? Anyways, the mid-ranked responses were a positively polarizing set of responses compared to the previous round for DPS, Tank, Ashe, Cassidy, D.Va, Echo, Kiriko, Lucio, Mercy, Orisa, Pharah, Ramattra, Reinhardt, Sigma, Sojourn, Sombra, Torbjorn, and Tracer, or 18 out of 42. The remaining 24 were negatively polarizing with the exception of Bastion, which was a tie. Compared to round 2, however, it was positively polarizing for every hero and role except for Reinhardt and Wrecking Ball. And since Wrecking Ball was a tie on that one, it was really only negatively polarizing for Reinhardt compared to round 2. Compared to round 1, it was positively polarizing for every hero except for Doomfist, Junker Queen, and Tracer. Again, remember our hypothesis here. Is it possible for me to shape a group of people's opinions with fake data in such a way that it would reflect that a group of people will consistently shift their opinions based on the opinions of others? So far, it's looking like a yes. Now, round 5 is a silly little funny round because this was pretty bullshit even by the standards of this study. Not only did I consistently give the influencers insane responses, I also had to hope that my audience would believe me when I said that these creators would even speak to me, and that they hadn't seen how any of these influencers actually feel. On this chart, the reddish-orange highlights represent the range of influencer responses, and the orange bars represent how people responded to this round. And let me tell you, frankly, this worked better than I had ever expected it to. For every single hero and role, the influencer responses had a positive correlation compared to the previous round's responses, despite being objectively absurd. Remember, the influencers were the first responses so far to typically go in the fully opposite direction from the Vivaros and mid-ranked responses relative to low-ranked responses with the exception of Baptiste, Tracer, and Zenyatta. You would think that after 3 rounds of being pushed in the same direction, they'd be a lot more resistant to getting yanked backwards, but they really weren't. In fact, for a ton of heroes and roles, DPS, Tank, Ana, Baptiste, Bastion, Lifeweaver, Pharah, Reaper, Widowmaker, and Zenyatta, this round was a record low rating after the influencers rated them low, and it tied the lowest previous ratings for Support, Mei, Orisa, and Sombra. When it came to heroes and roles rated highly by the influencers, we saw Doomfist, Junker Queen, Mauga, and Roadhog all hitting record highs as well. We're not going to compare every round to every previous round because we will run out of time, and I recognize I'm already taking up too much of yours as it is, but I do think it's notable that this was also a pretty positive correlation compared to the first round for the majority of heroes and roles. The exceptions were Ashe, Cassidy, D.Va, Echo, Genji, Hanzo, Iliari, Junkrat, Lucio, Moira, Reinhardt, Sigma, Sojourn, Soldier 76, Tracer, Winston, Wrecking Ball, and Zarya, plus Sombra was tied between rounds 1 and 5. And even then, remember, they were all positive correlations compared to their most recent responses, so even though they were split pretty close to 50-50 compared to round 1, shows a sharp deviation compared to where they'd been most recently. Now, time for the last round of the new data. Round 6 was when we introduced the high-ranked respondent data. Round 6 responses are the light blue bars, and the green highlights represent the high-ranked respondents' responses. Now, remember, these responses were always going to be touching the influencer responses. What we'd expect to see here is that high-ranked players are seen as authorities. Therefore, there's a positive polarizing factor here in the same direction as the previous round. And would you look at that? There is. Mostly, at least. For DPS, Tank, Support, Ashe, Brigitte, Cassidy, D.Va, Doomfist, Echo, Genji, Hanzo, Iliadi, Junkrat, Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Lucio, Mauga, Mei, Mercy, Moira, Pharah, Ramatra, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Sigma, Sojourn, Soldier 76, Torbjorn, Tracer, Wrecking Ball, and Zarya, it's a positive correlation compared to round 5, and a negative correlation for Ana, Baptiste, Bastion, Junker Queen, Orisa, Reaper, Sombra, Symmetra, Widowmaker, and Winston, plus a tie for Zenyatta. However, even among the ones with a negative correlation compared to round 5, there's still a positive correlation for them compared to round 1 for all except Orisa, Sombra, Symmetra, and Winston. Overall, it's been pretty clear that this round was generally one with a positively polarizing piece of data. However, now we're on to round 7, and for this round, respondents were not given any new data. Instead, they were given back their previous responses and asked to go from there. My initial theory was that I'd see people do one of two things. Either 1, they'd revert back to their starting position and scrap the answer they gave while being misled, or 2, they'd rely on the most recent answer given and ignore the old answers. Instead, they did this really cool, fun thing where they did both of those things and also sometimes just did something completely random. Like, okay, for DPS, Support, Ana, Bastion, Brigitte, Mei, Mercy, Ramatra, Reaper, Sojourn, and Torbjorn, 11 of the heroes and roles, the responses generally skewed close to the starting positions. But for Baptiste, Doomfist, Genji, Hanzo, Iliadi, Kiriko, Lucio, Moira, Orisa, Pharah, and Reinhardt, another 11 heroes, it skewed towards the most recent round. And for everyone else, the other 20 heroes, it was basically just a crapshoot. Like, genuinely, what the fuck was going on with Mauga here? For a bunch of these heroes, it seems like they just randomly decided between some combination of their original responses, their most recent responses, an average of their previous responses, and sometimes a brand new value that had never been expressed before within the range of any of their answers. Why? Truly not a clue. I wish I had a better answer for you here, but nobody here is making any goddamn sense. My best guess is that they didn't really know what to do with this data either. After all, most of them were being confronted with their own indecisiveness in a way they probably weren't really anticipating. And there wasn't really a way around it. They were being told that they had established a range of viable answers and were being asked which times they had been telling the truth or lying. And I think that led a lot of people to simply not acknowledge their own numbers when it wasn't convenient for them. There's not really an immediate trend that pops out to me in this final round, and I think that's because different people respond in different and inconsistent ways to this sort of situation. Nobody likes being called a hypocrite or inconsistent or feeling like they didn't know what they were doing. And nobody likes it when it's pointed out that they might have contradicted themselves, so I think a lot of people responded less consistently than they normally would have, or at least as consistently as they did in other rounds. Another important element of this is that they weren't being given an external influence or an external authority that they could appeal to or reject. It was only their own influence, and in doing so, I was effectively locking 7 different versions of the same person in a room and asking them to decide which one was right. I'm sure you can detect a pattern in this if you were given enough time, but the main thing to me is that this round didn't demonstrate the same kinds of consistent trends we saw in other rounds. And let's do that as a quick wrap-up, because we've still got to get to the tailored group. Now, it's important to remember that these are averages. On average, respondents were negatively polarized by low-ranked respondents. Positively polarized by my responses, mostly a coin toss but generally positive on mid-ranked respondents, positively polarized by the influencer responses, and generally positively polarized by the high-ranked responses. Then they went all over the fucking place with their own responses. Again, we'll get to some caveats later, but as of right now, I feel pretty confident in saying that, at least within the context of this pilot study, the hypothesis of, is it possible for me to shape a group of people's opinions with fake data in such a way that it would reflect that a group of people will consistently shift their opinions based on the opinions of others, can be answered with a yes. But remember, there were 2 groups and 2 hypotheses. So let's get on to the next one. Part 3.2, the tailored group. So, again, let's start out with a quick reminder of what hypothesis we're testing here. Is it possible for me to make people individually reject their own opinions if they are told that those are uniformly the opinions of low-ranked respondents, particularly when they are given false data that has been tailored to consistently tell them that other more authoritative respondents disagree more and more strongly with them? In order to do this, we don't want to do what we did with the generic group. We don't want to look at the average responses each respondent gave because that just wouldn't be useful. The tailored group's data was manipulated to be contrarian to them on an individual level, so evaluating their average responses wouldn't be useful to test this hypothesis. Instead, here's how we're going to do it. First, we're going to use each individual respondent's initial responses as their starting positions. Every change they make is going to be calibrated based off of this as the starting point, and then it will be recalibrated based off of their previous responses for future rounds. If they rated something as a 5 in their starting position in the first round, then 5 is their new 0. If they rated the next one as a 6, then that would be their new starting response going forward. We're also not going to be focused on the direction of the change, only the scale of the change. If their starting position was 5 and they went to a 4, that's a change of one position, not -1, because the goal is to see how far we can push people around. And since different respondents will have different starting positions of different values, using positives and negatives would risk respondents canceling each other out rather than actually reflecting how much movement there was. We'll take all 65 respondents in this group, see how much they shifted their position for each role and hero in each round, and then average it out to see how much they actually changed their position on each hero and role on average per round. Importantly, one of the variables we'll be looking for here is consistency in terms of the amount of change per round. Formulas were kept as consistent as possible across respondents, and in general they should be facing roughly the same amount of pressure as every other respondent to shift their position. For the generic group, we established which rounds had a positive or negative correlation, but in this one we'll want to see if there were certain rounds where the changes were larger or smaller than others. To prove this hypothesis, we would need to see general consistency across all respondents in terms of how much they moved from their previous position. If there are inconsistencies, we would need to come up with an explanation for why those inconsistencies exist. This group is kind of harder to explain the way we did with the generic group, going just from beginning to end straight out, and it's easier for us to start at the end, see our final stats, and then go back to the beginning and see how we got there. So, without further ado, let's look at our data and... Oh no, this shouldn't look like this. Okay, so, funny thing about this group, you guys did not do what was expected of you at all. Looking at the stacked bar chart, we're not seeing the two things we were initially looking for. Responses of different scale depending on which dataset they were being provided with, and for consistency of responses across datasets. For example, from round 1 to round 2, the change ranged from Soldier 76 at the low end at about 0.57 to Doomfist on the high end at 1.33. This doesn't really make sense given that for all heroes, the data provided in round 2 was individually targeted at making people feel like their prior opinions were a bronze take. And as we saw in the generic group, we know that people are generally negatively polarized by this. And sure, with the generic group, we saw it was less pronounced with some heroes than others, but the generic group wasn't facing standardized pressure. The generic group was facing standardized responses. And it'd be one thing if these trends continued through the following rounds, because then we could say, okay, certain heroes and roles are uniquely vulnerable to this, but the trends still hold true even if they affect certain heroes to a greater degree than others. But that also isn't the case. Okay, let's go through this round by round. From round 1 to round 2, which was the round where low-ranked responses were introduced, the average change was 0.894. And I would argue that we would generally want most responses to be within 0.1 plus or minus from that average to indicate some consistency. That isn't really the case. Only Support, Ana, Bastion, Cassidy, Diva, Echo, Iliadi, Junkrat, Junker Queen, Kiriko, Lucio, Mei, Ramatra, Reaper, Reinhardt, Sigma, Symmetra, Torbjorn, Widowmaker, Winston, and Zarya meet that threshold, which is literally only half the heroes at 21. From round 2 to round 3, the round when the Viveros responses were introduced, the average change was 0.795, almost exactly 0.1 lower than the previous change, despite this round featuring a greater deviation from the starting point. And the only heroes and roles that were within 0.1 of that average were Tank, Support, Ana, Cassidy, Diva, Echo, Genji, Hanzo, Junker Queen, Junkrat, Kiriko, Lucio, Mei, Mercy, Moira, Orisa, Pharah, Ramatra, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Sigma, Sombra, Torbjorn, Widowmaker, Winston, and Zenyatta. That's 26 out of 42, so at least it's a majority of them within the range this time, but it's not even the same heroes and roles. We've added Tank, Genji, Hanzo, Mercy, Moira, Orisa, Pharah, Roadhog, Sombra, and Zenyatta, and we have lost Bastion, Iliadi, Reaper, Symmetra, and Zarya. The only shared ones across both rounds in terms of being within that range are Support, Ana, Cassidy, Diva, Echo, Junker Queen, Junkrat, Kiriko, Lucio, Mei, Ramatra, Reinhardt, Sigma, Torbjorn, Widowmaker, and Winston. Is this starting to sound like the ramblings of a madman? That's because it is. This has driven me insane. But also, it is kind of relevant here. You know, I'm not just listing off all these hero names for fun. If there were a consistent effect being produced, we would expect to see heroes having similar effects from round to round, and they don't. We're not even seeing the same heroes at the lowest rate of change versus the highest. From round 1 to 2, it was Soldier at the lowest and Doomfist at the highest. From round 2 to round 3, it was Tracer at the lowest with 0.5 and Mauk at the highest with 1.15. Anyways, let's add in the change from round 3 to round 4, which was the round where mid-ranked respondents were introduced. When we do that, we get this. And notably, we get another diminishing return. This time the average change was only 0.569, which is down from 0.894 from round 1 to round 2, and 0.795 from round 2 to round 3. Again, the heroes within 0.1 plus or minus of this are Tank, Support, Ana, Baptiste, Bastion, Brigitte, Cassidy, Diva, Doomfist, Echo, Hanzo, Junker Queen, Junkrat, Lifeweaver, Lucio, Mercy, Moira, Orisa, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Sigma, Sojourn, Sombra, Torbjorn, Widowmaker, Wrecking Ball, and Zenyatta, or 27 out of 42. Again, a majority, and again, the majority grows, but we continue to see weird substitutions. Baptiste, Brigitte, Doomfist, Lifeweaver, Sojourn, and Wrecking Ball all make their first appearances in the in-group here, while this marks the first time that Kiriko, Ramatra, and Winston didn't make it into the in-group. Tank, Hanzo, Mercy, Moira, Orisa, Roadhog, Sombra, and Zenyatta all make a return from the previous round, and Bastion is the only hero to skip around and make a comeback as well. Ilyari, Reaper, Symmetra, and Zarya still haven't reappeared since the first round. Genji and Pharah disappeared after showing up last round, and Mei disappeared after appearing in both of the previous rounds. The only consistent appearances across all 3 rounds, indicating that these heroes and roles have consistently been close to the average rate of change, have been Support, Ana, Cassidy, Diva, Echo, Junkrat, Junker Queen, Lucio, Reinhardt, Sigma, Torbjorn, and Widowmaker, or just 13 out of the 42. 37 out of the 42 heroes and roles have appeared at least once, but after 3 rounds of data, it's noticeable that DPS, Ashe, Soldier, Mauga, and Tracer have not been close to the average rate of change once so far. Anyways, on to the next round. This is the change from round 4 to round 5, where the influencer responses were added, and we do actually see a reversal of trend here. The average rate of change has increased to 0.622 instead of continuing to drop. When we look at the chart, we can really see some heroes sticking out as outliers. DPS, Ashe, Bastion, Soldier 76, and Tracer are all very low, and Mauga is way higher than everyone else. Anyways, new average of 0.622, let's check out who got close. We've got Tank, Support, Ashe, Baptiste, Bastion, Brigitte, Cassidy, Diva, Doomfist, Echo, Genji, Hanzo, Junker Queen, Junkrat, Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Lucio, Mei, Mercy, Orisa, Pharah, Ramatra, Reaper, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Sojourn, Soldier 76, Symmetra, Torbjorn, Widowmaker, Winston, Zarya, and Zenyatta, or 33 out of 42. I'm sorry if it's a bit rushed, I'm trying to get it all done in a single breath. It's a lot. Again, we keep adding to the list within the range. I'm not going to break it down as much as before, just because I'm already taking up too much of your time again, but there are notable first-time appearances from Ashe and Soldier 76 here. However, the number of constants across all rounds has dropped again, with Ana and Sigma not appearing here for the first time, leaving us with just 10 constants. Support, Cassidy, Diva, Echo, Junkrat, Junker Queen, Lucio, Reinhardt, Torbjorn, and Widowmaker. For round 5 to round 6, which was the high-ranked respondents round, the average rate of change fell once again to 0.596. The heroes who were close here were Tank, Support, Ana, Bastion, Brigitte, Cassidy, Diva, Genji, Hanzo, Ilyari, Junker Queen, Kiriko, Mei, Mercy, Moira, Orisa, Pharah, Ramatra, Reaper, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Sojourn, Sombra, Tracer, Widowmaker, Zarya, and Zenyatta, which is only 27 out of the 42. Somehow we have even less consensus on this now. Significantly more heroes were close to the average last round for some reason, only to lose them again this time. Tracer also makes her first appearance here, leaving us with only DPS and Mauga that have never been close to the average. And it's just all over the place. This also marks the first time that Echo, Junkrat, Lucio, and Torbjorn have failed to appear, leaving us with just 6 constants. Support, Cassidy, Diva, Junker Queen, Reinhardt, and Widowmaker. Anyways, round 6 to round 7, final round, let's just do this. Remember, round 7 was where we gave them back their previous responses and told them to figure themselves out, and this was the round where the generic group kind of blue screened a bit. The average rate of change was 0.424, the lowest so far. The heroes and roles that were close were DPS, Tank, Support, Ana, Ashe, Baptiste, Bastion, Brigitte, Cassidy, Diva, Echo, Genji, Hanzo, Ilyari, Junker Queen, Junkrat, Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Lucio, Mei, Mercy, Moira, Pharah, Ramatra, Reaper, Reinhardt, Sojourn, Sombra, Torbjorn, Tracer, Widowmaker, Winston, Wrecking Ball, and Zarya, or 34 out of 42. This is the second highest amount of people appearing close to the average, and it's also the first time appearance of DPS, which also means Mauga never makes an appearance close to the average. All of our remaining constants did still make an appearance though, so we have the final 6 of them. Support, Cassidy, Diva, Junker Queen, Reinhardt, and Widowmaker. You know, I really expected this to go the other way. I thought the tailored group would absolutely be more manipulatable because I was literally tailoring the data to be as maximally contrarian as possible. And I mean, sure, I did still influence them, and part of the issue here is looking at averages as opposed to individual responses because some individuals were insane in terms of inconsistency, but as a group? Well, as a group, they just didn't respond how I would have predicted, and I don't think this data proves my hypothesis correct. However, that's not a bad thing. The purpose of a study like this isn't to be correct, it's to learn new things, and we did do that. So let's get into what we've learned. Part 4. Findings and theories. Now, I think it's safe to say that the tailored group really did not respond the way I had predicted, or in ways that match up with the generic group for the most part. Obviously, the two groups can't be compared one-to-one because of the nature of the data they were given, it's kind of apples and oranges, but in general, I think the most interesting similarity was that both groups responded relatively consistently to the influencer round. Remember, for the generic group, it was a positively polarizing piece of data for every single question, and for the tailored group, it was the round with the highest percentage of heroes and roles being close to the average rate of change. To me, this indicates that this round was somehow a relatively unifying one, despite also being the most bullshit. Another notable factor for this group is that the low-ranked respondents were the ones with the biggest impact by far on the tailored group, which I think reflects the fact that the low-ranked responses for the tailored group aligned directly with their existing opinions. Meanwhile, when it came to the generic group, the low-ranked respondents didn't actually seem to influence them as much as a group. The majority of them were still negatively polarized by the low-ranked responses, but it was a relatively slim majority, and nowhere near as impactful as other rounds throughout the study were. It's also relevant that, despite the low-ranked respondents being the ones who led to the highest average deviation for the tailored group, it was also the round with the fewest heroes actually close to the average. Only half the questions were answered within 0.1 points on either side of the average, and that indicates that even though the average variation was high, it wasn't consistent. And that might be for a few reasons. Now, I think my hypothesis for the generic group was correct. I was able to predict which datasets would cause which reaction from the respondents, indicating that it's possible to use them to influence the way people feel and corral a group of people's opinions into a new position based on nothing. However, I think my hypothesis for the tailored group was incorrect. I was not able to predict which pieces of data would have which effects on the respondents, and it seemed as though the fake data I was giving people wasn't really working the way I'd intended. I think part of why it worked for the generic group but didn't work for the tailored group is that people get suspicious when things line up a little bit too much. I think people generally expect they'll agree and disagree to some extent with the rest of the community, and I'm guessing you gotta provide a spoonful of sugar to help the lies go down. On top of that, the generic group's numbers would have made sense to most players even if they disagreed with them. They will have heard people at low ranks expressing those or similar opinions, and those averages did include those low-ranked players. However, if you're a GM-level player being told that your opinions are bar-for-bar bronze takes, you're likely initially confused, but eventually just take the numbers as being unrealistic to the extent you think they're not worth internalizing because you know that that's not what bronze players think. In fact, one of my respondents who was participating in the tailored group and is a high-ranked player himself commented to me early on that he didn't think it made sense that low-ranked players would rank Tracer so highly because they wouldn't be encountering her so much in their own games. Unless, he said, they were going off of what they'd heard from high-level players and influencers. But then he saw what the influencers said for him, and he knew something was up because they rated Tracer low. I think in an effort to influence the tailored group, I overshot and gave them such unrealistic numbers that it became hard to accept it. Especially because the numbers were absurd for everybody. The influencers rated Tracer around a 4 to a 6 for the generic group, which is definitely on the low end, but not impossible. But for people in the tailored group, that could have easily been a 2 to a 4, which would have been just absurd. Part of the issue here is that since the generic group used an average, it was a lot harder to get responses that were either very high or very low. Getting an average of 9 out of 10 from 65 people is hard, even though a lot of those 65 people will have rated it a 9. In order for the low-ranked respondents to rate something between a 9 or a 10 for the generic group, you would have needed an average of somewhere between a 9 and a 10 from hundreds of people, and that's just pretty uncommon. However, for the tailored group, anyone who did rate Tracer a 9 or a 10 would be getting responses based around that, which would have led to uniquely weird and hard to believe numbers. Same on the low end too, because averages will tend to pile up closer to the middle of the bunch even if some individuals rated things as a 0 out of 10. For the generic group, you'd be facing different pressure if you thought Iliari was a 0 than someone in the tailored group who had felt the same way. However, something that's also important to acknowledge is that I did ask all respondents for feedback, and there isn't really a correlation between people's groups and what their feedback was. People in both groups said, to pretty similar degrees, that they didn't allow the data provided to them to influence them that much. However, we know that the generic group was influenced pretty directly in terms of direction, and the tailored group was kinda all over the place. Neither group noted their data as being more absurd than the other group did, or there wasn't like a correlation between one group saying that it was absurd data more than the other group did, despite one group clearly getting more absurd data. If I had asked respondents which groups they thought they were in, I don't think either group would have had a particularly easy time until they learned the specifics of what led them to either spot. I think it's also important to recognize that the respondents did not all always respond on the same day. Some people would get their survey in the morning, fill it out right away, and then get the next one the next morning, and we're done in a week. Others would get their survey on one day, fill it out the next day, and then get their next survey the day after. There were some people who took nearly 3 weeks to complete the study, and something I did anecdotally notice but couldn't really quantify was that there did seem to be a correlation between respondents taking a longer pause between responses and the size of the difference in their decision being bigger. But this might just be that it stood out to me. Like, this might not be real, this might just be me noticing it more because I'm realizing this person took longer to get it done. When I asked for feedback, some respondents did say that they tried to remember their previous choices while others said they didn't, but it is worth acknowledging that some respondents did have more time to forget their previous responses before filling out the next surveys. And if I were going to do this again, I would set it up differently to make sure that nobody advanced until everybody advanced just to minimize the risk of an external variable. There's also the fact that some people were being influenced by external factors as well, most notably with a couple content creators being consistently brought up in the feedback. RQ does a lot of tier lists, and he was listed as one of the creators I'd gotten to fill out the study, and yet people saw him upload a tier list video while I was working on this that didn't align with what I'd said he'd said. Others mentioned that some of the hero rankings didn't make sense for a creator like Flats, who wouldn't have said what I said the influencer said. Say that 10 times fast. Part of this is that, obviously, I did not ask these people because I cannot imagine they would ever have responded to an email from me. But also, part of it is that I can't control other people's content. Even if I had asked these creators and had used legitimately expressed opinions from them, they might have uploaded a video expressing a somewhat contradictory opinion while the study was ongoing that could have influenced people. And that's not even talking about the many, many other Overwatch content creators that people watch who might have influenced them during the study. Even if the influencers expressed opinions that agreed with what I had said they had said, there's no way to guarantee that every single respondent will watch their videos. And if only some of them do, then it'll skew things because those people will have been given a justification for how the influencers feel about the heroes and roles when everyone else was only given numbers without context. It's truly impossible to conduct a study like this in isolation from external influences without a lot of money to sequester all of my respondents like they're a jury in a John Grisham novel about a legal crusade against tobacco companies. And so unless somebody's got those kind of resources for me, I don't think it'd be possible to eliminate those external influences. Anyways, another variable that I can't control is who actually completes the study. I had about 70 eligible signups who got eliminated for not completing the study in time, and while I was thankfully somehow still left with exactly the same number of respondents on both sides, the gender, age, and rank distribution did get a bit skewed. On top of that, regardless of whether or not I had used people's actual responses for the low, mid, and high-ranked respondents, I wouldn't have been able to guarantee that the actual responses used would only reflect the people who completed it. They might have effectively ended up shadowboxing people who weren't in the room to fight back. And this does actually matter because the people who dropped out might have dropped out for reasons that would reflect why they chose the things they did. Maybe they don't really give a shit about this stuff and hadn't put much thought into their answers, so they had put in some arbitrary numbers at the start that tainted the data. Maybe the study should have also excluded people who have never received a competitive rank, since you could pretty easily argue those people don't likely engage in the game in the same way as people who do, and so they don't have a fully fleshed out perspective on the topic. In any sort of sociological study, a major component will always be who didn't complete the study. It's like jazz. It's about the data you don't have as much as the data you do. Also, how many unintentional ways could the data have been affected by the presentation? The surveys were presented alphabetically, and as you progress through the rounds and there's so much data being thrown at people, they might just stop giving a shit by the time they get through 20, 30, or 40 nearly identical questions and will stop processing the numbers, and instead just throw whatever's in their head. The earlier in the alphabet a hero's name is, therefore, the more likely respondents are to be thoughtful in the responses, and the inverse is also true. Another element of this is that these questions do not exist in isolation from one another. If I asked you to rank DPS today, then tank tomorrow, then support the day after, and kept asking you each of these questions one at a time, I'd likely get different results than if you were asked all the questions all at once and in the order they were asked. If I put 3 heroes down that are maybe a 5, a 6, and a 5 next to each other, it's possible that your brain kind of drags down the 6 to a 5 because you see them all pretty similarly. On the flip side, if 2 heroes do have a stark difference in strength, like a 7 to a 3, the stark difference between the two might make you think the gap is even larger and rate them an 8 and a 3 or a 7 and a 2. Putting Iliadi right next to Junker Queen might have influenced how both of those heroes were ranked. Maybe if it hadn't been alphabetical, we would have seen heroes being ranked differently. As well, I could have separated the heroes by their roles and kept all the tanks separate from all the DPS and supports. We saw that people held different opinions about each of the 3 roles, but they didn't really bleed into the answers as much as it might have if the survey had instead been presented as a 3-page survey with all the DPS questions on page 1, the tank questions on page 2, and the support questions at the end. Ultimately, this is a pilot study. The purpose of a pilot study is not to be definitive, it's to see what's worth properly investigating in a full study and to see what direction that future study should take. The strongest argument I can make with the data from the study is that you can definitely use manipulated data like this to sway people in one direction or another, and that you can, to some extent, predict what outcomes you'll get from that manipulated data depending on who you pretended said it. However, I would point out that this is something that works better on a large scale with averages across groups, rather than trying to hyper-individualize it. It's easier to try and shift a large group of people like this with a more generalized dataset than it is to try and shift an individual with hyper-individualized manipulated data. I think that's about as much as I'm confident saying as a takeaway from this pilot study, but it does raise a final question. Part 5. Why does this matter? You might have been watching this whole time and thought, this is kind of interesting, but like, what does it matter even if the hypothesis is proven? And while I think that knowledge exists for its own sake and that the value is in knowing more about the world around you rather than just what you can do with that knowledge, this is something that goes beyond just silly opinions on video games. If this is truly how people respond and behave when provided with this kind of data, we would want to test and see if it extends beyond something as narrow and niche about feelings about balance in video games. For example, coming from a perspective of someone who has an education in communications, oh boy, there's a fucking lot I could do with this. You could use this knowledge pretty easily for marketing and advertising. And frankly, they kind of already do. A&W, the Canadian one, not that garbage you Americans are stuck with, has a long-running ad campaign where they'll have different groups of regular Canadians stopping by A&W and trying a new menu item, or, more importantly for our purposes, answering A&W trivia basically about prices or quality of products. However, the reason why these sort of advertising tricks happen right now is because it allows us to mask our advertisements as unvarnished, authentic opinions of real, regular people just like you and me. If the findings from this study held up, advertisements could be tweaked to have, say, 100 Canadians eating an A&W burger and then standing somewhere along a line to indicate how much they think it costs. You might dress up some of your respondents to look wealthier and have them overprice it substantially because they're, expensive people with expensive tastes and this fits with what they see as expensive tastes. Then you have some of your respondents dress up elderly to look like they're from an era where a quarter pounder cost a quarter and have them underprice it. And even then, only underprice it moderately. And then have some dressed up like your actual target audience for the advertisement and overprice it just a little in their estimation so that your target audience looks at those people and thinks, yeah, I'd probably say this burger is worth that much too. Then you reveal the price, everyone's excited, the price is lower than you thought it would be, and that's the ad. Alternatively, another use of this is politics. Again, to some degree, this is something that's already basically being done out there. There's a reason why conservatives fucking love to dress up like working class folks before telling you we need a flat tax rate, and it's because it's obviously negatively polarizing to be told that by someone who's visibly wealthy and powerful. They put in a lot of effort to look like a rich man's idea of a working class man, and it shows. However, with the data from this study, they might get the idea to start presenting their ideas as things that their ideological opponents, and more importantly, the people their base hates, are wrong about and that quote-unquote regular people are right about. Instead of saying, hi, I'm normal adult male and I want to talk to you today about the carbon tax, you might get a group of 100 Canadians delineate some as very clearly New Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, some of them as Conservatives, and some as ostensibly non-partisan regular Canadians, and ask them what they think the carbon tax price should be. You'd have your Greens and your New Democrats maxing out the answer, have the Liberals close to them but a little less far, then have the Conservatives right near zero, and then present your non-partisans as standing with the Conservatives. Again, is this like a fundamentally new thing? No. I'm not saying that this is revealing some new information that reinvents the wheel, but what it does do is potentially highlight how to more effectively manipulate people and the power of putting words into other people's mouths and caricaturizing them to manipulate other people as groups. I also think part of the value of this study is that it shows how vulnerable we are to this sort of manipulation. Multiple people in my study thought I had messed with the numbers, but they overwhelmingly thought I had just swapped them around, like that I'd said the low-ranked responses came from high-ranked players and vice versa, that sort of thing. However, nobody assumed the numbers were outright fake, and I think that's because we're generally inclined to believe there's got to be a kernel of truth in there somewhere, even if what we're being told doesn't really match with what we believe. I think it's also worth noting that, while some people did realize my data contradicted what certain influencers had said, the overwhelming majority of people never once mentioned that they felt the need to actively fact-check this. People mentioned that they had watched people like CarQ or Flats and said that it contradicted what the study had said, but none of them mentioned that they had specifically gone to fact-check the numbers either through their content or by contacting them directly. People gave me a, frankly, shocking amount of leeway to lie to them, and even though they knew I had also lied to them the last time I did one of these studies, they still believed me enough to keep going. And I think this part matters a lot, because in the age of the influencer, of which I'm definitely not one, let's be clear, it's very easy for them to get away with lying to you. Famously, fellow Canadian gay boy YouTuber James Somerton got caught by H-Bomber late last year in a massive scandal surrounding Somerton's plagiarism. But James wasn't plagiarizing, he was outright bullshitting about, or was just turning into misogyny for no real reason. And it's genuinely pretty embarrassing for me to admit that I was a fan of his stuff at one point. Not like a super fan, I wasn't super active, I wasn't a patron, especially because I didn't have any money, and I didn't follow him on other platforms, but I enjoyed a bunch of his videos. Watching H-Bomber video about James, and then Todd in the Shadows follow-up debunking his bullshit made me realize I'd been an idiot to not fact-check a lot of what he said. Like, James said Bellamy is why we have Skype. And I believed it. I could have so easily Googled it and found out the truth, and in general, that's the type of person I am. But I just thought like, damn, that's crazy, and took it in stride. After all, it's not like the claim was central to the video he had been making, it was just like a one-off fun fact, and why lie about that? Turns out there's a lot of reasons he lied about stuff, but what I'm more interested in is why I was vulnerable to that kind of lie. Back in the day, I was having a conversation with a family member about the Alberta New Democratic Party, and the family member in question mentioned, quote, they don't even have any lawyers. To which I said, no, they have at least 4 in their caucus right now, including the party's leader, Notley. The family member was just like, oh, really? I remember hearing that somewhere, but I can't remember where. And that is really the best you can hope for, because that family member dropped that going forward. They didn't try and hold on to that or try and say, no, you're wrong. A lot of people will double down on the fake news they've heard from somewhere, and then they build other bullshit on top of that lie, and then the problem at the core can never be dislodged because no one even knows where it is or that it's the key to dismantling the other bullshit they believe in. We are constantly being bombarded with a million little lies online that are so hard to fact check purely because they're a razor rather than a bazooka being fired at us. And misinformation is generally not a battle we're losing in terms of bazookas. It's death by 1,000 razors, where each little lie that goes unchecked and unchallenged serves to more and more aggressively unmoor us from reality until we're so detached that we can't connect to other people anymore. That H Bomber Guy video is also good to reference here because another major point he makes throughout the video is that content creators face a lot of incentives to steal and lie. It is hard to make good content and it takes time to do that work yourself. If you're a moron with no real charisma who can't string a sentence together for shit, looking at you in particular, Illuminati, then you can't win on quality if you want to make enough money to live on. You have to win on quantity, and the fastest way to put out a lot of content is to steal from others and play fast and loose with the truth. Like, okay, my most recent video, Just Say Magic Exists in Overwatch, is the highest earning video on my channel by a fair amount right now. As of time of recording, it's made about $350 in 2 weeks across 66,000 views. This is, to be clear, an abnormally good performance for one of my videos in terms of both view count and revenue. And I'm mentioning this not as a flex, but to help make it clear why the type of stuff I make is very much so not the norm. Usually, my videos make about $10 to $50 for 2 weeks of work, but even if every single one of them made $350 every 2 weeks, which, to be clear, is not the reality of my situation, it still wouldn't be enough to live on. Like, I'd need to be pulling in nearly 2 to 3 times as much just to live a decent quality of life and pay all my bills. And you know what would get me closer to that? Publishing more videos. However, making videos takes time and effort. For example, the video you're watching right now involves a month-long study and about 15,000 words worth of writing. But what if I didn't need to? What if I could just bullshit and steal? Again, enter Illuminati. There's a reason why I don't publish 3 videos a week, and it's not because I don't have enough ideas for it. I have a whole Google Doc with tons of ideas, and I'd love to make all of them, and I can't. It's because there's no way to keep up that scale of production, especially as a solo operation, while putting enough effort and attention to make something worthwhile without cutting corners. This is true of any instance where the incentive is to publish consistently, and where you can't let a lack of things worth publishing get in the way of publishing something. This is a problem that exists across the news industry in general thanks to the 24-hour news cycle, but is especially prevalent if you follow any sort of tea channels or drama channels that call themselves news channels on YouTube. YouTube rewards consistent uploads and consistent engagement with high watch time, which means if you want to make drama content, you need to sometimes invent drama content. As a VTuber, this is especially common with VTuber drama channels like Kyo or False ID. Even if they have definitely provided some valuable coverage at times in the past, the incentive to constantly produce daily quote-unquote news videos means that they inevitably end up becoming digital tabloids filling airtime with nothing at best or inflammatory bullshit at worst because they know that getting people angry is how you get them to click. This is not to defend the people that they have covered negatively because some of them definitely have deserved it, to be clear. It's just to say that that's what ends up happening. Drag race news channels, and again, quote-unquote news, also do the same thing because there's always somebody getting mad at somebody else on Twitter across the 1,000+ queens who've appeared on any of the Drag Race franchises at this point. This exists basically whenever anyone is doing media critique, whether it's about music, movies, TV, musicals, stage shows, or literally anything else. There's always an incentive to publish more, rush more, cut more corners, and do all that shit. This is especially common with video games, particularly since most gaming creators focus on a single game or franchise for the majority or all of their content. If your whole channel is about, I don't know, hypothetically Overwatch, you know that even if you try to branch out, you're likely going to get tanked in the algorithm because that's not what people want from you on your channel. If you run out of every intelligent, coherent thought you have about Overwatch, because, you know, eventually you've said all you need to say about a game like this as it stands, you either need to stop making content, which means you stop making money from this, or you find a way to manufacture more Overwatch content. I don't know if you know this, but that is basically what I do. I'm rarely making content about Overwatch itself, I'm just finding ways to manufacture content that builds off of and around Overwatch enough that I can justify calling it an Overwatch video and Overwatch fans will consider watching it. I've made videos explicitly about other stuff, but it never performs as well, and even when an ostensible Overwatch video is about something entirely different, it'll still perform better. However, that's still trying to be honest with my content. What about people who don't make stuff like this? What if they're making their millionth unranked GM, or they're a specialist in a hero trying to make their millionth how to rank up with X hero video because they don't have anything else? Eventually, they're gonna start bullshitting you. And you might just believe them because they're an authority. And why would you bother fact-checking them? Why would they lie to you about some small, insignificant bullshit? Look, it's complicated. For one, lying is often just a means to an end, but the end isn't necessarily convincing you to believe something untrue when it comes to content creators. It's just as often to make you think that the creator knows something you don't, to seem smart, or just to make the algorithm like you because you're putting out more content. Hell, if you lie and get called out in the comments, that counts as engagement, and YouTube might boost you even more. For another, if they're really being smart about it, which they're content creators, they probably aren't, they're trying to shift your frame of reference for reality to make you believe something untrue that no other creators believe, because then you're locked into their reality. If you want your content fixed, but the only person who believes in the same reality is the YouTuber who's casually restructured what you believe, then you'll need to go to that person to get your fix without getting frustrated. Part of what this study was about was evaluating how people respond to bullshit online, and how easy it is as a content creator to get away with it. People like James Summerton got away with it for years because he was bigger, he could silence people, and once you have momentum on your side, it's really easy to just steamroll everybody because proving that you're full of shit takes so much work and risks dragging the larger audience down on top of you. This is particularly true if you're operating within a niche and the community is a bit insular. Like, if I were to have gone after your Overwatch back in the day for that dog shit Sombra's a support video, it would have just resulted in me getting dogpiled. Hell, I got dogpiled for months after Seagull put out his dog shit reaction video to my survivorship bias video last year, even though he was wrong and I was right. But he has the bigger audience, so people will believe him when he's wrong. And yeah, I recognize I'm still a little bit bitter, even though it's been a year since that happened, because a bigger creator having to ride my content for views, resulting in me being called a bunch of slurs and told to kill myself without him saying a word, is gonna stick with me for a little bit. Moving on. The important thing is that there's not really an easy solution to any of this. The study was meant to figure out how influenceable people are, and what factors seem to influence them the most strongly and most consistently on both the individual and collective level. What we found was that influencers, individual people who have clout, are pretty capable of swaying people based on bullshit. And something worth mentioning is that this isn't unique to, like, people we think are dumb. I know some of the respondents in this study, and they're smart people. We all want to think we're too smart to fall for the million little lies on the internet, but we just aren't. In fact, sometimes that makes us uniquely vulnerable because we think that we could never fall for it, so we believe it, and then because we believe it, we assume it must be true because we're smart, we wouldn't believe something wrong. And this is especially true when they reinforce something we already wanted to believe. If you already believe a certain political party is full of incompetent tools, you're a lot more likely to just accept it without checking it if somebody tells you that they don't have any lawyers in their caucus. If you already want to believe that A&W burgers are good and affordable, you're more likely to just accept an ad's framing of it. If you believe that queer people have had a largely unrecognized impact on technology and science, you're more likely to believe it without fact-checking it when someone offers you an example of a time when that was true. Even if the overall fact is true, the example with Skype that was provided by James Somerton, for example, wasn't. If you want to believe that Sombra sucks and shouldn't be played, and a big YouTuber comes out with a video telling you why you're right and that she's just a support, you're gonna accept their argument and use it to justify your position without actually testing the validity of the argument. If you dislike a popular YouTube video and one of your favorite influencers makes a video roasting it, you'll accept their arguments as justifications for why you're right to dislike it, even if the arguments make no fucking sense. There's not really a way around this. There's no quick and easy solution to just say, oh, well, I just am not going to be tricked anymore. Like, nobody's going out there with the goal of being deliberately tricked into believing some bullshit. On top of that, nobody's too smart to fall for a little white lie once in a while. And sometimes you fall for one lie that makes it easier to believe another one, like how telling my respondents that something was a bronze take made it easier to convince them to shift their perspectives when they were told how others responded. And Overwatch content creators regularly do this shit. All they have to do is find some dumbass hot take on TikTok, react to it, call it a bronze take, and then say their opinion is something else. Like, this is very, very easy to do. And it's not even always malicious or wrong. Sometimes the wrong opinion is the one held by the bronze player, and their lack of skill and understanding is reflected in their bad opinion. That's why doing this in bad faith can be so effective. On the surface, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with associating a bad take with a low-ranked person if the low-ranked person is making the bad take. Somebody who's low rank indicates that they're not very good at the game and don't understand it very well, so they're likely to have some bad takes. It happens. However, you can just as easily invent a low-ranked player to get mad at over a bullshit take that you also invented just to get people angry and convince them to side with you. You're never going to be able to avoid all the bullshit, and this study is meant to show how easy it is to trick people. All of my respondents knew their opinions were being recorded, evaluated, and studied, putting them more on edge than the average person hearing some bullshit online typically would be, and they still generally fell for it. Imagine how much easier it would be if their guards were down and they weren't having to quantify how much their perspective changed by some shit they'd never fact-checked. Like, I wish there was a happy ending or something actionable here, but this study was mostly just about trying to confirm something I've felt for a while, seeing just how easy it is to be tricked online. And while this is just a pilot study and definitely isn't the end-all be-all, it honestly is not helping me feel more optimistic. Also, I know we're just wrapping up the video right now, but I hope this doesn't, like, erode all your trust in me. I promise I genuinely do try and tell the truth and be honest with my audience, although I will also make mistakes from time to time. Hell, it's possible I've made mistakes with this study that someone more well-versed in sociological studies will be able to point out in terms of misinterpreting data or not recognizing a flaw in the study structure that I should have. However, if I wanted to genuinely lie to you and trick you, I would have taken the results from the study, internalized them, and just told you guys, hey, sorry guys, this study didn't really work out, I'll have to try again sometime, and then just use this information to lie to you better. Or, hey, maybe I'm already putting these strats to work. Did you fact check me? Like at any point throughout this? Can you fact check me? What if the charts I've shown you weren't the real charts? What if I didn't actually use any pieces of data provided to me by the respondents and I just made some shit up? I'm just kidding. I didn't do that. Can you prove it? No. Can I prove it? No. You just have to trust me. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed being rambled at by an insane person for well over an hour. It will be happening soon because the next video on the channel is going to be a ruthless vivisection of Inescapable No Rules No Rescue, the worst game you've never heard of that's also going to go for over an hour. Also, if you were a respondent and wondered what happened with the Ultimate Battle Pass bundle raffle, that was handled on stream back in late March, and you can check the VOD for it on the VOD's channel by clicking the card in the top right or finding the link in the description. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and consider becoming a channel member. Memberships cost $5 a month, and channel members get to vote for one topic per month. Last month, they picked the Just Say Magic Exists in Overwatch topic, which then proceeded to do some stupid numbers, as mentioned earlier, so let's see if you guys can strike gold again. This month's poll began on the first between these 5 topics. First up is I'm Not Toxic, I'm a Nerd, the Liz Lemons of Overwatch, a returning topic from October, December, and January focused on how nerds, non-derogatory, have often internalized being the underdog to the extent that they fail to see when they're being the bully. If this topic places 3rd or lower, it'll be eliminated from future polls. Next is how video games distort people's perceptions of real-world resources. Another returning topic, this one from December and February, focused on how resource extraction games like Minecraft influence how we perceive real-world resources. If this one places 4th or lower, it'll be eliminated. Then we've got drag queens, VTubers, and gestures privilege. This returning topic first appeared in December and March, and would focus on how performing through the facade of a character allows an entertainer unique privileges that they otherwise wouldn't be able to access. This one will also be eliminated if it places 4th or lower. Our 4th topic is how Overwatch is hostile to new players. This is the first new topic for April and will focus on how Overwatch has become increasingly hostile to new players as well as what can be done about it. Lastly, there's you stagnating and competitive isn't Blizzard's fault. Another new topic, this one focused on explaining why it isn't Blizzard's fault that you're not constantly climbing and ranked. If you'd like to pick one of these 5 topics, voting is still ongoing right now as of April 5th for the first round. If none of these topics wins a majority of the vote by the end of the day on the 7th, there will be a runoff between the top 2. Channel memberships are a huge part of why I'm able to make content consistently for this channel, so if you've enjoyed this or any other videos on the channel lately, consider becoming a member. It really does help a lot. Thank you to all of my current channel members. MiniQ, Olesp, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Yoshi of the Wire, CatLover192, Sourdough, Illuma Riley, Venus, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavost, Marshallis, and Crimson Cyclo. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.